Hi guys, and welcome to Quiet History Vault. Tonight we step into a world where winter is not a season you simply dress for, but a force that locks the entire landscape into silence, where you are surrounded by endless white slopes, and the only sound you hear is your own breath, slowing in the cold air. You arrive at a lonely mountain cabin in the early evening light, the sky already fading into a deep steel blue. And you probably won't survive this if you were dropped here without preparation, which is exactly why people in the 19th century treated winter as something almost alive, something that demanded respect rather than comfort. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Tell me where you are watching from and what time it is for you right now, because somewhere out there, someone is listening in the middle of their own quiet night. Now dim the lights, flow straight into the story, no extra headings. You stand on packed snow at the edge of a wooden cabin tucked into a narrow mountain valley. The air is so cold it feels almost solid, like you could lean against it. Smoke curls faintly from a stone chimney, but even that warmth seems fragile against the scale of the surrounding winter. In many frontier settlements of 19th century mountain regions, cabins like this were the last barrier between life and the indifferent cold. A mainstream historical fact is that settlers in alpine and high-altitude frontier zones often planned entire seasons around winter survival, storing supplies months in advance, because travel would become impossible once snowfall deepened. You can feel that reality now as you step closer to the door where frost has built delicate patterns along the wood like frozen lace. Inside the cabin is dim lit by a fire that struggles to hold its shape in the hearth. The logs shift and crack, sending sparks upward like brief orange thoughts disappearing into smoke. The warmth does not spread evenly. It clings to the hearth and fades quickly into the corners where darkness waits. You notice immediately that nothing here is accidental. Every object has a purpose, every shelf, every hook, every hanging tool is part of a system designed to keep humans alive when nature outside becomes unrelenting. Cabins in these regions were often built from heavy timber, cut during warmer months, logs carefully notched and stacked to reduce gaps. A quirky tidbit from frontier archives describes how some builders would stuff moss and even dried grass between logs, believing certain mountain mosses could help hold warmth longer, a belief that sounds almost poetic now. Historians still argue whether such techniques provided measurable insulation, or whether they simply gave psychological comfort to those enduring long winters. You remove your gloves and immediately regret it. The cold bites with surprising intelligence, as if it knows exactly where to find weakness. The family living here moves with practiced rhythm, not speaking much. Their silence is not sadness, but efficiency. Every action is measured. Wood is placed carefully near the fire. A kettle sits at the edge of the heat, never too close, never too far. You realize quickly that in this environment, excess movement means wasted energy, and wasted energy means vulnerability. The fire becomes the center of your awareness. It is not just warmth, it is structure, timekeeping, even companionship in a place where isolation stretches days into something unrecognizable. You watch the flames shift and think about how people in remote mountain settlements in the 19th century often described the hearth as the true heart of the home, more important than furniture or decoration. Without it, the cabin is simply a wooden box slowly returning to the cold. Outside wind presses against the walls. You can hear it slipping through tiny imperfections in the wood. The sound is soft but persistent, like something testing for weakness. Even here, in what feels like shelter, the mountain is still present. Snow piles against the outer walls, gradually reshaping the cabin's outline. You settle onto a bench and feel the weight of stillness begin to grow. Time behaves differently in places like this. Minutes stretch longer, not because they're slower, but because there is less to divide them. You think about how people must have marked their days not by clocks, but by firewood meals and the changing intensity of light through small windows. A scholarly debate continues among historians regarding how early mountain settlers psychologically endured long wintry isolation. Some argue that strict routines preserved mental stability, while others suggest that communal storytelling and superstition played a larger role than discipline alone. You can almost see both ideas blending here in the quiet gestures of the cabin dwellers and the way they glance at the fire as if it might speak back. As night deepens, the cabin feels smaller, not physically but perceptually, as though the darkness outside is gently pressing the walls inward. You hear wood shift in the ceiling, beams, a reminder that even shelter is not static in extreme cold. Everything contracts, everything tightens, everything conserves. You're offered a simple bowl of stew, thick with preserved beans and salted meat. The taste is plain but grounding. In survival conditions like these, flavour is not the goal, endurance is. Families in mountain regions often relied on dried legumes and salted provisions and stored in root cellars, a practice that became essential across many frontier communities where supply routes disappeared under snow for months at a time. After eating, you notice how the cabin feels slightly warmer, or perhaps your body has simply adjusted. The fire continues its steady work, consuming logs at a pace that always feels too fast. Someone rises to add another piece of wood, and you understand instantly that this task never ends. Fire is not maintained once, it is maintained always. The wind outside intensifies briefly and the sound shifts across the roof like a passing wave. You imagine what it must feel like to be outside in it, to have no barrier at all between skin and storm. Snow builds in layers so quickly that paths vanish within hours. Entire mountain routes can disappear overnight, leaving travellers trapped or forced to wait until spring. Inside conversation is minimal, but the silence is not empty. It's full of attention. You begin to notice small details, the way steam rises from the kettle, the way frost slowly creeps along the window edges like pale fingers searching for cracks. Even your own breathing becomes part of the environment. As the evening continues, you feel the first true weight of isolation settle in. This is not loneliness yet, but something closer to awareness, the understanding that beyond these walls there is only distance, snow and silence that stretches across entire mountain ranges. And somewhere in that silence, winter waits without urgency, simply existing present and absolute. You wake to the sound of the cabin settling, a soft groan of wood reacting to the deep cold as if the structure itself is slowly breathing in and holding its breath through the night. The fire has burned lower, and the first thing you notice is how quickly the warmth retreats when the flames lose strength. In this world, heat is not constant. It is negotiated moment by moment, and the cabin exists only because someone understands that negotiation well enough to keep it going. As morning light filters through a small uneven window, you finally begin to see the structure that kept you alive through the night. The walls are made of thick logs stacked with careful intention, each one fitted into the center or the next with notches carved by hand. In many frontier regions of the 19th century, builders relied on locally felled timber because transport across mountain terrain was nearly impossible once winter arrived. A mainstream historical fact is that entire mountain communities would schedule logging seasons months in advance, choosing trees not just for strength but for how well they would dry before snow sealed the landscape. You run your hand along the interior wall and feel subtle variations in texture. Some gaps are filled with hardened moss, others with clay mixed with straw. The cold seeps through in faint threads, not enough to destroy warmth completely, but enough to remind you that this is not a sealed world. It is a negotiated space between human effort and natural force. Outside, snow presses silently against the cabin walls, reshaping the lower edges like a slow tide. You realize the cabin is partially buried already, though from the inside it still feels like a full structure. This dual reality is one of the quiet tricks of winter survival. Inside feels stable, while outside constantly erases stability. You notice how the roof is angled steeply designed so that snow will slide off rather than accumulate too heavily. This is not decoration, it is survival geometry. Every angle, every beam, every joint exists because someone once experienced collapse and learned from it. A quirky tidbit from mountain settlement records describes how some builders would hang small bundles of dried herbs above door frames, believing certain scents could discourage frost spirits from entering. While clearly not scientific, these practices often coincided with practical benefits, since herbs like sage also helped repel insects during warmer months, when cabins were reused. Historians still argue whether these rituals were purely symbolic or whether they reinforced careful maintenance habits that indirectly improved survival outcomes. You step closer to the hearth area and see how the chimney rises through the centre of the structure, built from stone rather than wood. Stone holds heat differently. It absorbs it slowly, releases it gradually, and in many frontier cabins it served as the only reliable buffer between flame and freezing wind. The stone is darkened from years of smoke, its surface uneven like memory layered upon memory. The smell inside the cabin is a mixture of burnt wood, dried meat, and cold air that never fully leaves. It is not unpleasant, but it is constant, like a background truth you learn to accept. You begin to understand that this cabin is not simply a shelter. It is a system. Every part is connected. The wood supply determines the fire. The fire determines the water. The water determines whether anyone inside can function at all. Even silence feels part of this system because unnecessary noise wastes energy in ways that are not immediately visible, but always felt. You think about how builders in alpine regions of the 19th century often preferred cabins partially embedded into slopes, using the earth itself as insulation. This technique reduced exposure to wind and helped stabilize internal temperature. A mainstream historical fact is that semi-dugout designs were widely used in harsh mountain climates because they significantly reduce firewood consumption during long winters. As you move around the cabin, you notice storage areas built into the walls. Shelves hold dried foods in tightly sealed containers. Hooks support tools designed for repetitive daily survival tasks. Nothing here is ornamental. Even the smallest item has been justified by necessity at some point. You trace your fingers over a wooden beam and notice faint marks carved into it. These are not decorative carvings, but tally marks, possibly tracking days, storms, or wood usage. In isolation, time becomes something you measure manually. You begin to understand how easily weeks could blur together when the outside world disappears under snow. A soft creak draws your attention to the door. Cold air slips through the edges in thin, invisible streams. Even a well-built cabin cannot fully resist pressure differences created by wind and temperature shifts. The mountain is always trying to enter. You sit again near the hearth and watch the remaining embers glow. The light is weaker now, but still present, like a memory refusing to disappear. Someone in the cabin adds another log, and you hear the shift of responsibility in that simple act. Keeping fire alive is not a task you complete. It is a condition you maintain continuously. Outside, the wind strengthens, briefly pushing against the structure with a low, steady force. Snow slides down the roof in soft collapses. You imagine how many times this sound must have marked survival days in these regions, each shift of snow, both relief and warning. A scholarly debate continues among historians regarding whether cabin insulation techniques in remote mountain settlements were primarily driven by shared knowledge or individual experimentation. Some argue that design spread slowly through migration routes, while others suggest isolated families independently develop similar solutions because environmental pressure forced convergence. You begin to feel the cabin as something almost alive, not in a mystical sense, but in the way it responds to temperature pressure and human presence. It expands slightly with heat contracts with cold and accumulates the history of every fire that has burned inside it. The floorboards are uneven underfoot, shaped by years of moisture and drying cycles. Each step produces a faint sound that disappears into the fabric of the structure. Even movement feels absorbed here, as if the cabin prefers quiet. You notice how light shifts across the interior as the sun rises higher outside, though it never fully reaches warmth. Winter sunlight in mountain regions often carries brightness without heat, a kind of distant illumination that reminds you of time passing without offering comfort. You reflect on how people must have learned to read this light. Not for beauty, but for survival cues. When to travel, when to stay, when to conserve firewood, when to prepare for incoming storms. The cabin becomes a lens through which nature is interpreted, not escaped. A final detail catches your attention near the window. Frost patterns have formed intricate branching shapes, almost like frozen rivers or tree roots. They change slowly, as warmth from inside slightly melts their edges, only for new crystals to form again in the cold air pressing from outside. It is in this quiet tension between inside and outside that you realize the true design of the cabin is not to eliminate winter, but to delay its arrival just long enough for human life to continue. And as the day settles into its cold rhythm, you understand that every beam, every stone, every carefully chosen log is part of a long conversation between survival and silence. The fire is the first thing you check even before your thoughts fully settle into morning awareness, because in a place like this, waking up does not truly begin until you confirm that warmth still exists. The embers are dim but alive, a dull orange pulse buried under ash and half-burned wood. You lean closer, feeling the faint heat against your face, and for a moment the entire cabin feels like it is holding its breath with you. Outside the window, the world is still pale and silent, a flat expanse of snow that reflects light without offering warmth. In many 19th century mountain regions, settlers quickly learned that winter mornings could not be treated casually. A mainstream historical fact is that entire frontier communities organized their daily routines around fire maintenance cycles, ensuring that embers were never allowed to fully die overnight, because rekindling flame from scratch in freezing wind could take hours and sometimes fail entirely. You add small kindling carefully, almost ceremonially, watching how the ember reacts. It brightens slowly, reluctantly, as if remembering what it's supposed to become. Fire here is not instant. It is coaxed into existence through patience and attention, and you begin to understand why so much of life in these cabins revolves around anticipation rather than immediacy. The cabin smells slightly different in the morning, less smoke-heavy, more of cold wood and lingering warmth trapped in corners. You notice how the air near the floor remains colder, while heat collects closer to the ceiling. This uneven layering of temperature is a constant reality in primitive insulated spaces. You shift slightly and feel the difference immediately, as if the air itself has invisible strata. Someone inside the cabin moves quietly, adjusting a pot near the hearth. Water is being melted again from snow collected earlier. This is a routine so embedded in survival life that it becomes almost invisible. Yet without it, everything collapses. A quirky tidbit from Frontier Journals describes how some families would mark snow collection spots outside their cabins with wooden poles, believing certain drifts produce cleaner melting water. In reality, this may have simply helped them avoid contaminated areas near animal tracks, though historians still argue whether such practices were deliberate hygiene strategies or accidental discoveries. You step closer to the door and notice how the inside latch is thick with frost. Even protected structures accumulate cold over time. You push it open and a wave of air presses in sharp and immediate. The outside sound is almost nothing, just a faint whisper of wind moving across endless snowfields. The mountain landscape is completely transformed by winter. Paths that existed in autumn are now erased. Trees appear half swallowed, their lower branches buried, their upper limbs stiff with ice. You realize how easily direction can be lost in this environment. Without landmarks, everything becomes repetition. Back inside, the fire grows stronger, and the cabin begins to reclaim its fragile balance. You watch how quickly the space responds. Heat spreads unevenly but persistently, pushing back against the cold in slow increments. This is not comfort as modern life understands it. It is resistance. You begin to observe how every object inside the cabin is positioned for efficiency. Chairs are close to heat sources. Tools are stored within arm's reach. Food is placed in predictable locations so that no unnecessary searching wastes energy. In isolation, even small movements have cost. A mainstream historical fact is that many mountain communities in the 1800s relied on seasonal isolation as a normal part of life, often remaining cut off for months at a time due to snowfall blocking passes and trails. This was not seen as unusual, but as a recurring condition that shaped architecture behaviour and even social expectations. You notice a small stack of wood near the hearth carefully measured, rather than casually piled. Each piece represents future warmth, future meals, future survival. Nothing here is accidental abundance. Everything is calculated scarcity. Outside, a faint movement catches your attention. A bird lands briefly on a snow-covered branch, its small shape almost lost in the brightness. It survives in a world that seems impossibly harsh, yet even it moves with economy, conserving energy in short, precise motions. A scholarly debate continues among historians regarding whether isolation in mountain cabins produce stronger communal bonds or increase psychological fragmentation over long winters. Some argue that shared survival tasks reinforce cooperation, while others suggest that prolonged confinement led to heightened sensitivity and internal withdrawal. Standing here, you can almost sense both possibilities coexisting in the same space. You return inside and feel the difference immediately. The cabin is no longer just shelter. It is a controlled environment that must be actively maintained against collapse. Even silence feels managed as if noise itself is rationed. The fire now produces steady warmth and the kettle begins to release faint steam. The sound is soft but persistent, a reminder that even water must be negotiated with in this environment. Nothing flows freely without intervention. You sit for a moment and let your eyes adjust to the dim interior light. Shadows shift gently as the fire flickers. The cabin feels both stable and temporary at the same time, as if it could survive the winter only if continuously persuaded to do so. You notice small repairs along the walls, fresh patches of clay where cold air once slipped through, reinforced beams where stress had begun to show. Every mark is evidence of adaptation, a record of ongoing negotiation with the mountain outside. A quirky tidbit from some frontier accounts mentions that families sometimes hung metal objects near windows, believing the sound of subtle vibrations in wind could warn them of approaching storms. While this may sound like superstition, it also functioned as an early sensory alert system, however imperfect. The day continues in slow rhythm, wood is added, water is melted. Small tasks repeat without ceremony. Time does not feel like progression here. It feels like maintenance. You begin to understand that survival in this cabin is not about moments of heroism, but about repetition that never ends. Each action supports the next, forming a chain that must not break. Outside, the snow remains unchanged, yet you know. It is not static. It is always moving, always settling, always reshaping the world beneath it in ways you cannot see from inside. And as you sit in the faint warmth of the hearth, you realize that the greatest danger is not the storm itself, but the moment you stop responding to it. The morning is fully settled now, though. Morning feels like a generous word in a place where daylight arrives slowly and without warmth. You notice how the cabin never truly becomes bright, only less dark, as if winter itself is filtering every hint of clarity before it reaches you. The fire is steady again, and that steady crackle becomes the rhythm that replaces clock's bells and any sense of external time. You are handed food without ceremony. It is simple, dense, and practical. Dried beans softened in broth, a few strips of salted meat, something warm enough to convince your body that energy still exists in the world. In the 19th century mountain frontier, preserved food was not a convenience, but the foundation of survival. A mainstream historical fact is that households in remote alpine regions often prepared entire winter provisions during late summer and early autumn, carefully calculating how many calories each member would need to endure months of isolation. You sit near the hearth, again noticing how your awareness has already begun to adjust. Cold no longer feels shocking. It feels constant, like a background condition that you must plan around. The cabin itself seems to encourage this adaptation. It does not comfort you so much as train you. Outside, the snow has deepened slightly overnight. It presses against the lower walls like a slow, patient force. You realise that the cabin is effectively sinking into winter, not moving through it. Every day the outside world becomes less accessible. Firewood becomes the central concern almost immediately after breakfast. You watch as someone checks the stack again, not because they are unsure, but because checking is part of the ritual that prevents uncertainty from growing. In these conditions, reassurance is practical rather than emotional. A quirky tidbit from Frontier Diaries mentions that some mountain families would assign specific names to their firewood stacks, treating them almost like living reserves with personalities. Whether this was humour, habit, or psychological coping is unclear, but it reveals how deeply survival objects were woven into daily perception. You step toward the window and notice how frost patterns have thickened overnight. They spread in branching shapes, delicate but relentless, as if the cold is trying to rewrite the glass itself. The outside world appears softened, erased at the edges, losing detail with every passing hour. Inside, the air shifts as another log is added. The fire responds instantly, brightening, expanding its reach. Heat in this environment is never stable. It is always reacting to human intervention. Without attention, it retreats. You begin to observe the rhythm of labour more carefully. Wood must be brought in split and stacked. Water must be melted and protected from freezing again. Food must be rationed with quiet precision. Each task feeds into the next, forming a loop that defines existence here. A mainstream historical fact is that many mountain cabins in the 1800s were designed with dual storage systems, keeping essential supplies both inside living spaces and in partially buried exterior caches to protect against sudden depletion or fire risk. This redundancy was not luxury. It was survival logic shaped by long experience with isolation. You notice how even breathing feels slightly different here. The air is dry but heavy with smoke particles and warmth. Your lungs adjust without permission, learning the environment faster than your thoughts can fully process it. Scholars still debate whether the endurance of frontier winter communities depended more on environmental adaptation or on strict social structure enforced within households. Some argue that hierarchy and discipline maintained order during long isolation, while others suggest that flexibility and shared responsibility were more important than any rigid system. You watch as someone repairs the loose section of wall using a mixture of clay and straw. The material is pressed into cracks with practiced hands. This is not renovation in the modern sense. It is continuous survival maintenance, a process that never truly ends because winter never stops applying pressure. Outside, a faint wind passes across the valley. It is not violent, but it carries enough force to shift snow in subtle waves. You realise how even small movements of air can reshape the landscape when given enough time. Another quirky tidbit from mountain settlement records describes how families sometimes place small stones near door thresholds, believing they could weigh down drafts and prevent cold air from entering. While this belief has no scientific basis, it likely coincided with practical attempts to seal gaps more carefully in high-traffic areas. You return to the hearth and feel the familiar pull of warmth again. It becomes easy to underestimate how quickly comfort can disappear if the fire is neglected. Everything here is conditional. Time continues to stretch in unusual ways. You are no longer sure how long the morning has lasted. There is no rush, only maintenance. The concept of urgency is replaced by continuity. You observe how conversation inside the cabin remains minimal but purposeful. Words are used sparingly, not out of sadness, but because silence conserves energy and focus. Even speech feels like a resource. Outside, the snow light intensifies briefly as clouds thin, creating a brightness that reflects off every surface. It is beautiful in a distant, unreachable way. You understand now why many settlers described winter light as both revealing and deceptive. It shows everything yet warms nothing. You sit back and notice the subtle hum of the cabin itself, the faint creaks and shifts that come from temperature changes. The structure is always adjusting, always responding. It is never fully still. And in that quiet, you begin to understand the deeper truth of this place. Survival is not a single act of endurance. It is the accumulation of countless small responses to an environment that never stops asking for them. By the time the light shifts again, the cabin has already moved through several invisible phases of activity. Nothing dramatic happens here yet. Everything is constantly in motion in small necessary ways. You begin to notice that survival in this mountain winter is less like a battle and more like a continuous accounting of resources, especially when it comes to firewood. You are taken outside briefly and the cold meets you like a physical presence. It does not rush. It simply exists around you, waiting for exposed skin, waiting for hesitation. The woodpile stands near the cabin wall, partially shielded by an overhanging roof. Each log is stacked with intention, not randomness. In many 19th century mountain regions, firewood collection was the most critical daily task once winter fully set in. A mainstream historical fact is that households often calculated wood consumption by estimating how many hours of heat each stack could produce under specific weather conditions. You watch as an axe is pulled from its resting place. The sound of chopping wood is sharp, echoing briefly across the valley before being absorbed by snow. It is a sound that carries both urgency and routine. Every strike represents future warmth but also present effort, and you start to understand why physical labour here is never rushed. Energy is too valuable to waste. Inside accounts from frontier settlements describe how families treated firewood almost like currency measuring value, not in coins, but in time of heat. A quirky tidbit from some rural journals mentions that children were sometimes taught to estimate wood stacks, visually learning to predict how long a pile would last through storms. Whether this was formal education or informal survival instinct is still debated. You return inside and feel the immediate contrast. The cabin wraps around you again, not warmly exactly, but predictably. The fire has been maintained in your absence, and that continuity itself becomes reassuring. Someone adds another log and the flames respond with a brief rise, as if acknowledging the contribution. You begin to realize how much of life here is structured around preventing decline rather than achieving improvement. The goal is not comfort but stability. That distinction becomes clearer with every passing hour. Scholars still debate whether frontier communities develop their intense focus on resource management out of necessity alone, or whether cultural traditions from earlier rural societies reinforce this behaviour. Some argue that pre-existing agricultural habits carried over into winter survival strategies, while others suggest that the extremity of mountain environments forced entirely new systems of thinking. You notice how the cabin responds to temperature changes throughout the day. When the fire burns stronger, the walls seem to relax slightly. When it weakens, the structure tightens again, as if bracing against pressure. This constant feedback loop between human action and environmental response defines everything here. Outside, the wind picks up briefly, carrying fine snow that scrapes softly against the walls. The sound is almost like sand moving across stone, except colder, quieter, more persistent. You realize that even weather has texture in this place. A mainstream historical fact is that many mountain cabins in the 19th century were deliberately built near sheltered slopes or tree lines to reduce exposure to wind corridors, which could dramatically increase heat loss and firewood consumption. These placement decisions were often the difference between manageable winters and catastrophic fuel shortages. You sit near the hearth again, watching how the fire consumes wood at a steady pace. There is no pause in its demand. It transforms physical material into temporary comfort, and that transformation must be constantly renewed. Nothing in this system lasts. A quirky tidbit from frontier accounts describes how some families believed certain types of wood burned with calmer flames and preferred them during long nights, even though this likely reflected differences in moisture content rather than any mystical quality. Still, these perceptions shaped careful selection habits that may have improved efficiency without fully understanding why. You begin to notice how the act of chopping wood is not just physical labour, but psychological structure. It breaks the day into segments. It provides measurable progress in a world where otherwise everything feels continuous and indistinct. The cabin's interior smells faintly of smoke resin and stored food. These scents mix into a kind of identity for the space. It is not unpleasant, it is simply total. Outside, snow continues to accumulate in slow increments. You cannot see it moving, but you know it is changing the world around the cabin. Roof edges grow heavier. Paths disappear further. The boundary between shelter and wilderness becomes more abstract with each passing hour. You notice how the people inside the cabin rarely speak about future days. Plans exist only in short spans. Tomorrow is considered, but next week feels distant in a way that is almost irrelevant. This narrowing of temporal focus is not resignation. It is adaptation. Scholars still debate whether this kind of temporal compression in isolated mountain communities contributed to stronger immediate resilience or whether it limited long-term planning and development. Some interpretations suggest it allowed for sharper focus on survival, while others argue it may have constrained broader innovation. You watch as another log is split outside the sound, briefly cutting through the silence like a signal. Then it fades again, absorbed by snow and distance. Inside, the fire continues its steady work. The cabin remains upright not because it is strong in itself, but because it is constantly being maintained. You begin to understand that in this world nothing is ever finished. Everything is ongoing. And as you sit in the low light of the hearth, you realize that firewood is not just fuel. It is time stored in physical form, waiting to be spent. The day deepens without announcing itself, as if time here prefers subtle transitions rather than clear markers. You notice how the cabin never truly changes in appearance, yet your perception of it shifts constantly. The fire remains the central presence, and everything else arranges itself around that living point of heat. You are given heavier clothing before stepping closer to the door again. The fabric is thick, layered, and slightly stiff from repeated use. In 19th century mountain regions, clothing was not simply protection from cold, but a carefully constructed system of insulation. A mainstream historical fact is that wool remained the dominant winter material for frontier communities because its fibers retained warmth even when damp, a crucial advantage in snowy environments where dryness could never be guaranteed. Outside, the cold is sharper than before, as if it has grown more focused during your brief time indoors. You feel it immediately through the layers pressing in rather than simply surrounding you. Snow reflects light in a way that is almost disorienting, turning the landscape into a continuous pale surface without clear boundaries. You watch as clothing is adjusted with practiced precision. Every layer has a purpose. Inner fabrics trap body heat. Outer layers block wind, and intermediate layers create small insulating pockets of air. Nothing is accidental. Nothing is decorative. Even the smallest fastening matters. A quirky tidbit from frontier clothing records mentions that some mountain settlers would sew small hidden compartments into their garments, not only for storage, but also to protect matches and tinder from moisture. Whether this was widespread practice or isolated ingenuity is still debated among historians, but it reveals how deeply survival thinking influenced even personal clothing design. You step back inside and the contrast is immediate again. The cabin feels almost warm by comparison, though you now understand that this warmth is fragile and conditional. The fire has been carefully tended, and its glow expands into the room like a slow pulse. You begin to notice how the interior space is divided not by walls, but by temperature zones. Near the hearth, warmth gathers densely. Further away, cold lingers in quiet pockets. The cabin is less a single environment and more a layered map of heat distribution. Scholars still debate whether the design of frontier cabins unintentionally created early forms of environmental zoning awareness, or whether such spatial understanding emerged purely from lived necessity without conceptual planning. Some suggest that people learnt these patterns instinctively, while others argue that knowledge was gradually formalized through repeated experience. You sit near the fire and observe how steam rises from a pot suspended above the heat. Water is once again being drawn from melted snow, a process that never stops. Every drop of liquid here is transformed from solid winter, briefly returned to usefulness before inevitably freezing again unless carefully guarded. Outside, the wind shifts direction slightly. The sound changes character, moving from a low pressure against the walls to a faint whistling through unseen gaps. Even the cabin seems to listen, adjusting its internal temperature in response. A mainstream historical fact is that many mountain cabins in the 19th century incorporated adjustable ventilation gaps near rooflines, allowing controlled airflow to reduce smoke buildup while still preserving heat. These small openings required constant monitoring, as too much airflow could quickly drain warmth from the interior. You notice how smoke behaves inside the cabin. It rises in predictable paths, then disperses slowly near the ceiling. It never feels chaotic, it feels structured, as if even fire obeys rules in this enclosed space. A quirky tidbit from rural mountain accounts describes how some families believed the direction of smoke patterns could indicate changes in weather. While not scientifically reliable, this belief sometimes aligned with actual atmospheric shifts, leading people to trust visual cues from their own hearth, more than distant predictions. You begin to feel how deeply interconnected everything is here. Clothing, fire, architecture, food, and even silence all function as parts of a single survival system. The thing operates independently. The fire is adjusted again. Another log is placed carefully, not forcefully. You notice the hesitation before it is added, the brief awareness of cost. Every piece of wood represents future hours that must now be accounted for. Scholars still debate whether the emotional relationship settlers developed with fire was purely practical, or whether long exposure to constant flame created symbolic or psychological attachment. Some argue that fire became a focal point of identity and security, while others maintain it remained strictly functional despite its centrality. You shift slightly and feel how the floorboards respond differently in various parts of the cabin. Some sections are warmer due to proximity to the hearth, while others remain persistently cold. The building itself feels like it's divided into survival gradients. Outside, snow continues to accumulate without sound, and you cannot hear it falling yet. You know it is changing everything beyond the walls. Roof lines are becoming heavier. Paths are disappearing further. The world is slowly flattening into uniform whiteness. A mainstream historical fact is that prolonged winter isolation in mountain regions often required residents to perform structural inspections of their cabins multiple times per week, checking for snow, load, stress, and ice buildup to prevent collapse. This was not occasional maintenance, it was routine survival discipline. You return your attention to the fire again because it always demands it. The flames shift, brighten, then settle. It feels almost like breathing. And in that steady rhythm, you begin to understand that survival here is not about conquering winter. It is about continuously negotiating with it moment by moment without pause. Night in the mountains does not arrive like it does in towns or cities. There is no gradual fading of activity, no distant hum of human life that continues beyond sight. Instead, darkness simply takes over what little light remains, and the cabin becomes an isolated point of warmth inside an otherwise silent world. You notice the shift first in the window. The pale reflection of snow outside loses detail, turning into a flat, dim surface that no longer offers depth. Inside, the fire takes on greater importance, not just as heat, but as the only reliable source of visible movement. In many 19th century mountain communities, nighttime survival depended heavily on controlled fire usage. A mainstream historical fact is that families often reduced fire intensity overnight to conserve wood, accepting colder interiors in exchange for long-term fuel security. You sit closer to the hearth as the temperature drops slightly. The change is subtle but noticeable, like a slow retreat of comfort. The cabin does not fail, but it adjusts downward into a colder equilibrium. Every decision made earlier in the day now becomes more significant. Water becomes the next concern. A pot of melted snow sits near the heat, carefully positioned so it does not refreeze. You watch it closely, noticing how even liquid state feels temporary here. Nothing remains stable without attention. In frontier mountain life, water collection and preservation were constant tasks, especially in winter when natural sources froze solid. A quirky tidbit from settlement journals mentions that some families would store heated stones near water containers to slow freezing, a method born from observation rather than formal science. You shift your position and feel how the floor carries cold upward through your boots. The cabin is warm only in specific areas, and outside those zones the cold remains patient and present. It does not rush, it waits. Scholars still debate whether nighttime routines in isolated mountain cabins were primarily shaped by environmental necessity or whether cultural habits from earlier rural life influenced structured evening behavior. Some interpretations suggest that strict nightly routines reduced anxiety, while others argue that they were simply efficient adaptations to limited resources. You notice how conversation inside the cabin becomes even quieter at night. Words feel heavier, as if they require more energy to produce. Silence is not awkward here, it is efficient. It reduces unnecessary heat loss through activity and maintains focus on essential tasks. Outside wind moves across the valley again. You cannot see it, but you can hear its presence in shifting tones against the cabin walls. Sometimes it sounds distant, sometimes close, as if the structure itself is listening to changes in pressure. You observe the fire carefully. It has entered a steadier state now, no longer bright and active, but controlled and sustained. This is intentional. Too much flame would consume fuel too quickly. Too little would allow cold to reclaim the interior. The balance is delicate and constantly managed. A mainstream historical fact is that many mountain cabins in the 19th century used nighttime fire rotation systems where household members took turns monitoring the hearth to ensure it never fully died. This practice was especially common in regions where temperatures dropped far below freezing and rekindling fire in the morning was difficult. You begin to understand how sleep itself is shaped by this environment. It is not uninterrupted, it is conditional. Even rest must coexist with awareness of the fire, the structure, and the temperature. A quirky tidbit from frontier accounts describes how some families would place metal tools near the hearth at night so they could be quickly heated for morning use. While practical, this also created faint noises as metal expanded and contracted, which some believed helped them gauge overnight temperature changes. You lean back slightly and feel the cabin settle around you. Wood creaks gently as it responds to internal heat loss and external pressure. The structure is never fully still. It is always adjusting, always negotiating. Scholars still debate whether the psychological effects of long winter nights in mountain isolation led to heightened sensory awareness, or whether people simply learned to interpret environmental signals more effectively over time. Some argue that isolation sharpened perception, while others suggest it altered emotional thresholds for silence and darkness. You notice how your attention becomes more sensitive to small details. The flicker of flame, the faint movement of steam, the distant sound of shifting snow. In another environment, these would be background elements. Here they become meaningful. The cabin feels smaller at night, not because it physically changes, but because darkness compresses perception. Edges blur. Distance disappears, everything becomes immediate. You realize that outside the mountain is completely invisible now. It still exists buried under snow and darkness, but it no longer offers visual reference. The world has narrowed to what is inside these walls. A mainstream historical fact is that mountain settlers often relied on predictable nightly rhythms to maintain psychological stability during long winters, including fixed sleeping times, repeated evening chores, and consistent fire management routines. These patterns created structure in environments where external cues were minimal. You watch the fire one more time before settling deeper into stillness. It continues its quiet work, consuming fuel, producing heat, holding back the cold in an ongoing negotiation that never truly ends. And as night deepens fully, you begin to understand that in this place darkness is not an absence of light, but a presence that must be managed just like everything else. Morning arrives again in a way that feels less like a beginning and more like a gradual easing of darkness. You do not wake to sunlight so much as you wake to a slightly less oppressive shade of grey outside the window. The fire is still alive, though reduced to glowing embers that seem fragile, as if a single careless breath could disturb their survival. The first sound you notice is wood shifting in the walls. It is subtle, almost like the cabin is stretching after holding itself rigid through the night. In mountain frontier life during the 19th century, this kind of constant structural movement was well understood. A mainstream historical fact is that log cabins were intentionally built with flexible settling in mind, allowing timber to contract and expand with temperature changes rather than resisting it completely. You move slowly, conserving warmth without thinking about it. Even your gestures feel measured now. Cold teaches economy. Nothing is done without reason. Near the hearth, ashes are carefully separated from unburned fragments. These remnants are not waste. They are potential warmth waiting to be revived. You watch as small embers are coaxed back into life with practiced attention, and the fire responds in stages like memory returning. Outside, the snow looks slightly different than yesterday, not reduced but reshaped by wind. It forms shallow ridges and smooth curves like a frozen ocean that never stops moving even when it appears still. You step closer to the window and notice how frost has grown thicker along the edges of the glass. It forms delicate crystalline patterns that spread outward in branching networks. A quirky tidbit from rural mountain accounts describes how some settlers believed frost patterns could predict weather changes, interpreting shapes as signs of incoming storms or clearer skies. While this belief lacks scientific foundation, it often coincided with real shifts in atmospheric pressure that observant residents gradually learned to recognize. Inside, someone begins preparing water again. The routine is unchanged from previous days, yet it never feels automatic. Every repetition carries importance because failure would mean immediate consequence. In this environment, repetition is survival. You begin to notice how the cabin organizes time in layers rather than sequences. Fire maintenance, food preparation, water melting, wood handling. These cycles overlap, creating a rhythm that replaces conventional hours. Historians still argue whether the strict repetition of daily tasks in isolated mountain settlements functioned primarily as psychological grounding, or whether it emerged purely as an unavoidable response to environmental pressure. Some interpretations suggest that routine helped preserve mental stability, while others emphasize that resource scarcity forced rigid structure regardless of human preference. You sit near the hearth again, watching the fire rebuild itself from ember to flame. It is never sudden. It is always gradual, requiring patience that feels almost reciprocal. The fire does not simply serve you. It demands attention in return. Outside, a faint sound moves across the valley. It is not wind alone, but wind interacting with distant trees, snow crust, and uneven terrain. The landscape produces its own subtle music, though it is easily missed unless you are listening for it. A mainstream historical fact is that many 19th century mountain cabins were designed with elevated door thresholds and reinforced foundations to prevent snow intrusion during prolonged storms, reducing interior moisture buildup and structural weakening over time. You notice how the interior air shifts as the fire strengthens. Warmth rises again, but unevenly, creating invisible layers of temperature. Your body adapts to these micro changes without conscious effort. A quirky tidbit from frontier journals mentions that some families would keep small stones heated near the fire and place them under bedding or seating areas to extend warmth into colder parts of the cabin. These simple thermal tricks reflected an intuitive understanding of heat retention long before modern insulation science. You begin to sense how deeply this environment shapes perception. Small differences in temperature become significant. Light changes feel meaningful. Silence becomes structured rather than empty. Outside, the world remains fully buried in snow. Paths do not simply disappear here. They are erased and rewritten constantly, as if the mountain refuses to remember human movement for long. You observe the cabin walls again. They are no longer just structure. They feel like memory made physical, holding traces of every fire, every storm, every adjustment made in response to pressure from outside. Scholars still debate whether frontier mountain cabins should be understood primarily as static shelters or as an adaptive system that evolved continuously with environmental conditions. Some argue they functioned like living structures shaped by ongoing necessity, while others maintain they were simply practical constructions refined over time through experience. You shift your position slightly and feel the difference between proximity to the hearth and the outer edges of the room. This spatial awareness becomes instinctive. You do not think about warmth distribution anymore. You feel it. The fire continues its steady work, consuming fuel at a pace that always feels slightly too fast. Yet without it, everything would collapse quickly into cold silence. And as the day settles into its quiet rhythm again, you begin to understand that survival here is not a single act repeated daily, but a continuous conversation between human effort and an environment that never stops responding. This cabin feels different when you wake this time, though nothing obvious has changed. It is more a sense of awareness than a visible shift, as if your mind has begun to adjust itself to the rhythm of this place. The fire is already alive again, tended before you fully opened your eyes, and its glow gives the interior a familiar, almost stable shape. You notice something subtle today. The silence is not just absence of sound, it has texture. It feels layered, like it contains depth, rather than emptiness. In 19th century mountain settlements, long winters often created conditions where people experienced extended isolation without external communication. A mainstream historical fact is that some frontier families could go months without encountering anyone outside their household due to blocked mountain passes and heavy snowfall. You sit up slowly and realize that your sense of time has already begun to blur. It is no longer measured in clear units. It is measured in fire cycles, meal preparation, and small maintenance tasks that repeat with slight variation. Outside the window, the world is unchanged in appearance, but not in meaning. Snow still covers everything, but now you recognize patterns in its surface. Subtle ridges, faint depressions, and wind-shaped textures that you would not have noticed earlier. Your perception has become more sensitive without you deciding for it. A quirky tidbit from mountain settlement accounts describes how some families would carve simple lines into interior beams to mark days of isolation, not for precision, but to maintain a sense of continuity. Whether this was widespread practice or occasional behaviour is still debated among historians, but it reflects the need to anchor time when external references disappear. Inside the cabin, movement is minimal but purposeful. Someone adjusts a hanging pot, checks the fire, and shifts wood closer to the hearth. Every action has a clear function. There is no excess motion. Even standing still feels intentional here. You begin to notice your own breathing more clearly. The air is warm near the fire, but cooler toward the edges of the room. This gradient shapes how you move without you fully realizing it. You unconsciously prefer certain areas of space over others, guided by temperature rather than thought. Scholars still debate whether prolonged isolation in mountain environments led to altered cognitive mapping of space, or whether people simply became more attuned to environmental gradients that were always present but previously ignored. Some interpretations suggest heightened environmental sensitivity, while others emphasize adaptive efficiency and resource awareness. You step closer to the hearth again. The fire is stable now, but it requires constant attention to remain that way. A log is added carefully, not hurriedly, as if even forceful movement could disrupt the balance. Outside, a faint brightness spreads across the snow, not warmth but reflection. The light feels distant, almost detached from the sun itself. It illuminates everything without softening anything. A mainstream historical fact is that mountain communities in the 19th century often relied on indirect weather interpretation methods, observing cloud layering, snow texture, and wind behavior, rather than expecting reliable forecasts from distant settlements or written communication. You begin to understand how observation becomes a survival skill here. Not dramatic observation, but constant passive awareness. The ability to notice small changes before they become large problems. A quirky tidbit from rural alpine journals mentions that some settlers believed certain sounds inside cabins, such as popping wood or shifting beams, could indicate upcoming weather changes. While scientifically inconsistent, these observations sometimes correlated with real environmental shifts caused by temperature and pressure changes. You sit again feeling the steady rhythm of the fire. It no longer feels unpredictable. It feels like a managed system, though you also understand that this stability exists only because someone continuously maintains it. Outside, snow remains motionless to the eye, yet you know it is not still. It is settling, compacting, reshaping itself under its own weight and wind influence. The landscape is in constant quiet motion even when it appears frozen. You begin to notice how the cabin itself influences your sense of safety. It does not eliminate danger. It simply contains it, holding it at a distance that must always be respected. Scholars still debate whether emotional resilience in isolated frontier environments was primarily a result of physical adaptation to harsh conditions, or whether it emerged through shared cultural expectations that normalized endurance as part of daily life. Some argue that resilience was taught, while others suggest it was inevitably developed through lived repetition. You glance toward the corner of the room where stored supplies are kept. Everything there represents future time, future survival, future cold days that have not yet arrived but are already accounted for. The fire crackles softly, marking the passage of another invisible moment. There is no urgency, only continuation. And in this steady unfolding, you begin to realize that the most profound change is not in the world outside, but in how you now experience its stillness. The weather changes before you notice it, not with drama or sudden violence, but with a quiet shift in pressure that the cabin seems to register before you do. The fire still burns steadily, yet something about the light outside feels heavier, more muted, as if the sky itself has lowered closer to the ground. You step toward the window and see that the snow is no longer simply resting. It is moving again, carried by wind that sweeps across the valley in broad, invisible waves. In 19th century mountain regions, storms like this were not unusual during deep winter cycles. A mainstream historical fact is that blizzards in high-altitude frontier zones could last for days, often isolating entire households and cutting off any possibility of travel or resupply until conditions improve. Inside the cabin feels slightly smaller today, not physically but perceptually, as the storm presses its presence into every gap and edge. You can hear faint sounds of air slipping through tiny imperfections in the wood, like the structure is quietly negotiating with the storm outside. A quirky tidbit from frontier mountain accounts describes how some settlers would listen to storm patterns through the walls, claiming they could distinguish between ordinary wind and approaching blizzards by subtle changes in tone. While not scientifically precise, these observations often help them prepare for longer periods of isolation. You move closer to the hearth where warmth is strongest and notice how quickly the fire becomes central again. It is no longer just comfort, it is protection. The flames rise and fall with a rhythm that feels almost responsive to the weather outside. Scholars still debate whether the heightened awareness of environmental sound in isolated mountain cabins was a learned survival adaptation or an inevitable psychological response to prolonged silence and limited sensory input. Some suggest that residents developed acute auditory sensitivity, while others argue that they simply had fewer competing sounds to distract attention. Outside, the storm strengthens. Snow moves horizontally now in bursts, blurring the line between ground and sky. The landscape disappears entirely at moments, replaced by a shifting white surface that seems to have no depth. You notice how everyone inside the cabin adjusts behavior without discussion. Movements become slower, more deliberate. Doors are checked more carefully. Firewood is brought closer to the hearth in anticipation of higher demand. There is no panic, only preparation refined through experience. A mainstream historical fact is that mountain communities in the 19th century often treated incoming storms as extended periods of confinement during which mobility ceased entirely, and households relied fully on stored provisions and interior resources for survival. You observe how the cabin responds structurally to wind pressure. The walls creak faintly but hold. Snow begins to accumulate unevenly along one side, slowly reshaping the exterior profile. From inside, you cannot see this change directly, but you understand it is happening continuously. A quirky tidbit from Alpine settlement records mentions that some families would place small marks on interior door frames to track snow depth outside, using subtle changes in door resistance as an indirect measurement tool when visibility was completely blocked. Whether this method was accurate or simply habitual is still debated among historians. You sit again and feel the fire's heat shifting across your body. One side is warm, the other slightly cooler, depending on how the flames move. This uneven warmth becomes familiar, almost comforting in its predictability. The storm outside produces a low continuous sound like a distant ocean trapped behind walls of snow. It does not rise or fall dramatically, it simply persists. Inside, time feels even more compressed. There is no sense of day advancing, only the continuation of conditions. You begin to understand how storms redefine time itself, replacing progression with endurance. Scholars still debate whether prolonged exposure to such storms contributed to altered perception of duration among frontier inhabitants, or whether time simply became irrelevant due to lack of external reference points. Some interpretations suggest psychological adaptation, while others emphasize environmental dominance over routine cognition. You watch the fire again. It consumes wood steadily unchanged by the storm outside. This constancy becomes its own form of resistance against the overwhelming presence of weather. Outside, wind briefly intensifies, pushing against the cabin with a force that makes the structure respond with a deeper creak. Then it eases again, continuing its long, uneven cycle. A mainstream historical fact is that many mountain cabins were designed with reinforced roof angles and compact structural footprints specifically to reduce wind resistance and prevent snow accumulation collapse during extended winter storms. You begin to realize that survival here is not about stopping the storm. It is about maintaining internal conditions while the external world becomes temporarily unreachable. And as the wind continues to move across the valley, you sit in the steady glow of the hearth and understand that isolation is not a moment here. It is a weather pattern of its own. The storm has not fully passed, but the cabin has already learned how to exist within it. You notice this strange adjustment, how the structure no longer feels like it is resisting the weather so much as cooperating with its limits. The fire remains the only constant source of motion inside a small contained world of shifting orange light. You sit closer to the hearth than before, not because you are cold in a dramatic sense, but because proximity now feels like strategy. In 19th century mountain frontier life, fire was not simply warmth, it was central infrastructure. A mainstream historical fact is that many isolated households treated the hearth as the core of all domestic activity, where cooking, drying clothes, and even social interaction were arranged around its unpredictable but essential presence. The sound of wind outside has softened slightly, though it never disappears. It moves in uneven rhythms across the valley, sometimes pressing against the cabin walls, sometimes retreating like a breath that never fully completes its cycle. You begin to understand how deeply sound shapes perception in this environment, where visual cues are often erased by snow and distance. A quirky tidbit from Alpine settlement diaries describes how some families would hang simple suspended objects indoors, such as spoons or small metal pieces, to detect subtle vibrations caused by wind pressure changes outside. While not a formal scientific method, these improvised indicators sometimes helped residents anticipate shifts in weather intensity. Inside, the fire becomes more than heat again. It becomes a point of reference for everything else. You find yourself watching it without intention, as if it is quietly organizing your sense of time. Flames rise, collapse, and reform in patterns that never repeat exactly yet remain familiar. Scholars still debate whether the psychological centrality of fire in isolated mountain cabins was purely functional, or whether prolonged exposure created symbolic associations that influenced emotional attachment and memory formation. Some argue that fire became a surrogate for social presence, while others maintain it remains strictly utilitarian despite its psychological effects. You notice how the cabin's interior feels more cohesive today, not because anything has changed structurally, but because your awareness of its systems has deepened. You understand where warmth gathers, where cold lingers, where air circulates in invisible paths between walls and ceiling. Outside, snow continues to shift in slow accumulation. The storm is less violent now, but more pervasive. It does not demand attention, it simply remains. You're given a task that requires moving water from melted snow into a container near the fire. The process is careful. Nothing is rushed. Even small actions carry consequence in this environment. In frontier mountain regions, water management during winter storms was critical for survival. A mainstream historical fact is that households often melted snow in controlled portions to avoid wasting fuel, balancing heat consumption against hydration needs. You begin to realize how every resource is interdependent. Fire affects water. Water affects food, food affects energy, and energy affects the ability to maintain fire. Everything loops back into itself. A quirky tidbit from mountain survival accounts mentions that some families preferred collecting fresh snow from specific exposed surfaces, believing differences in texture indicated purity. While this belief was not always scientifically accurate, it often led to more careful selection of collection sites away from animal paths or debris. The storm outside briefly intensifies again and the cabin responds with a low creaking sound. It is not alarming anymore, it's familiar. You begin to interpret these structural sounds as communication rather than warning. You sit back down and feel how the fire stabilized again after adjustment. It no longer fluctuates unpredictably. It is being managed, shaped, guided. This controlled fire becomes a symbol of continuity in an environment defined by external unpredictability. Scholars still debate whether structured fire management routines in isolated mountain cabins were primarily driven by practical necessity, or whether they gradually developed into ritualized behavior that helped maintain psychological order during prolonged isolation. Some interpretations suggest that repetition itself became stabilizing regardless of intention. You glance toward the darker corners of the cabin. They remain cold, slightly distant, like separate rooms within the same structure. The contrast between warmth and cold becomes more noticeable the longer you stay still. Outside, the storm begins to lose some of its intensity, not ending, but easing into a slower rhythm. The snow still moves, but less aggressively. A mainstream historical fact is that many 19th century mountain communities developed layered insulation strategies in cabin construction, combining log walls, moss filling, and interior heat retention techniques to extend survivability during extended storms that could last several days or even weeks. You realize now that the cabin is not simply shelter from weather. It is a controlled interruption of nature's reach, a temporary negotiation space where human life can continue under conditions that would otherwise be unlivable. The fire continues its steady movement and you remain near it. Not because you must, but because everything in this place naturally orients itself toward it. And in that quiet balance between storm and flame, you begin to understand how survival here becomes less about resisting winter and more about learning how to live inside its rhythm. The storm has eased into a quieter presence, but the cabin does not relax. It simply adjusts. You notice how every reduction in external pressure is met with a subtle recalibration inside, as if the structure itself understands that winter rarely leaves all at once. The fire remains steady and its glow now feels less like survival and more like routine continuity. You are already familiar with the morning rhythm, yet it never feels identical. Each day begins with checking what has changed overnight, even if the changes are small enough to miss at first glance. The embers are carefully revived again, coaxed into flame with practiced patience. In 19th century mountain frontier life, this repetition was essential. A mainstream historical fact is that daily survival routines in isolated cabins were often structured around fire revival, food preparation, and water melting as fixed points anchoring time In environments where natural cues were unreliable, you notice how your senses are becoming more refined without intention. The sound of wood shifting, the faint hiss of melting snow, the soft crack of expanding timber, all of it forms a language you now understand more clearly than before. Outside, the landscape is still muted by snow, but visibility is slightly improved compared to the storm's peak. Shapes begin to re-emerge in the distance, though they remain indistinct and softened by frost. It feels like the world is slowly returning, but cautiously, as if unsure whether to fully reveal itself again. A quirky tidbit from Frontier Journals describes how some mountain households would keep a dedicated storm log where they recorded changes in wind direction, snow texture, and firewood usage during long winter events. While not standardized practice, these personal records sometimes has helped families anticipate recurring weather cycles. Inside the cabin, the fire is now the center of all motion again. You observe how every task naturally orients around it. Water is placed nearby to thaw. Food is prepared within its reach. Even sitting positions are chosen based on warmth distribution rather than comfort alone. Scholars still debate whether the structured daily routines of isolated mountain communities emerged primarily as conscious systems of survival organization, or whether they evolved organically through repeated exposure to environmental constraint. Some suggest deliberate adaptation, while others argue that necessity alone shaped behavior without formal planning. You move closer to the window and notice faint outlines forming beyond the snow. Trees begin to appear again, though they are heavy with frost and bent under accumulated weight. The world outside feels like it is reassembling itself slowly after being erased. The cabin interior remains stable but not static. Heat continues to circulate unevenly, creating invisible zones of temperature. You instinctively avoid colder corners now without thinking about it. Your body has learned the map of this space through repetition. A mainstream historical fact is that many mountain cabins in the 19th century incorporated multiple heat retention strategies, including layered timber walls and centrally placed hearths designed to maximize radiant heat distribution while minimizing fuel loss during long winter periods. You watch as someone adjusts stored supplies again, checking quantities without urgency. Inventory here is not about abundance. It is about awareness. Knowing what remains is as important as using it. A quirky tidbit from Alpine settlement accounts mentions that some families would mark food containers with symbols rather than numbers, especially in households where literacy varied, creating a visual system of tracking consumption over time. Whether this was widespread or localized remains uncertain. Outside wind briefly returns, but it is weaker now, more like residual movement than active force. Snow shifts gently along surfaces no longer driven aggressively, but settling into new positions. You begin to notice how your perception of silence has changed again. It is no longer empty. It feels structured, almost layered, as if different depths of quiet exist simultaneously. Scholars still debate whether prolonged exposure to environmental silence in isolated mountain regions contributed to heightened internal reflection, or whether it simply reduced external stimulation to the point where cognitive attention naturally turned inward. Interpretations vary between psychological adaptation and environmental influence. You sit near the hearth, once more feeling the warmth stabilize around you. The fire is not dramatic today. It is consistent, almost calm, and that consistency becomes its own form of reassurance. The cabin, now familiar, no longer feels like an external shelter. It feels integrated into your perception of normality. You no longer think of it as separate from survival. It is survival made tangible. And as the softened winter light returns in faint fragments beyond the window, you begin to sense that the storm has not truly ended, but simply changed its manner of presence. The cabin feels different in the early stretch of what passes for morning here, even though time itself has become unreliable in the absence of clocks you can fully trust. You rely instead on the fire's behavior, on how the light shifts across the wooden walls, on the subtle changes in how your breath appears in the air. Winter in remote mountain shelters often turned human life into a system of observation rather than schedule. You step closer to the hearth as if drawn by instinct rather than intention. The fire is lower than before, a quiet bed of glowing coals that still hold warmth like memory. You begin the careful process of rebuilding it, adding thin kindling first, then slightly thicker pieces, watching for the exact moment when hesitation becomes ignition. A mainstream historical fact is that in many 19th century mountain cabins, fire maintenance was considered the first essential task of the day, even before food preparation or outdoor assessment, because losing the hearth often meant losing the ability to perform every other survival activity. The wood you use is stored carefully, each piece selected for how slowly it burns rather than how easily it catches. Nothing here is wasted casually. You start to understand that fuel is not simply material, but future time measured in warmth and cooked meals. Outside, the storm's remnants linger in softer form. Snow still falls in uneven intervals, drifting rather than striking. The world beyond the window looks less like a battlefield now, and more like a sealed archive preserved under layers of quiet white. A quirky tidbit from mountain settlement accounts describes how some isolated families would rotate firewood in specific indoor positions so that each log rested before use, believing it burned more evenly when acclimated to interior temperature. While modern interpretation sees this as unnecessary, it reflects a deeper attentiveness to material behavior in extreme environments. You notice how your attention has changed again. Small details feel larger. The angle of smoke rising from the chimney, the way heat pools near the floor, the faint condensation patterns on cold glass. Everything becomes data without feeling mechanical. Scholars still debate whether this heightened sensory awareness in isolated winter environments represents an adaptive survival skill, or whether it reflects cognitive narrowing caused by prolonged environmental restriction. Some argue it sharpens perception, others suggest it reduces mental range. You turn away from the window and return to the center of the cabin. The fire is beginning to stabilize again, transitioning from fragile flame to steady structure. You can feel its influence spreading evenly now, warming not just air but surfaces, objects, even the sense of space itself. In 19th century frontier mountain life, another mainstream historical fact is that cabin layouts were often designed around heat distribution, with sleeping areas positioned to maximize residual warmth, while storage areas were kept in cooler zones to preserve food and materials. You find yourself adjusting your position without thinking, following the invisible gradients of warmth and cold. Your body has begun to negotiate with the room rather than simply occupy it. A quirky tidbit from Alpine oral histories mentions that some families believed fire flames could predict mood changes and weather, interpreting unusual flickers as signs of incoming storms or shifts in atmospheric pressure. While not scientifically reliable, such interpretations often influence daily decisions about travel or resource use. Outside, a faint shift occurs in the light. The snow brightens slightly, not because it stops falling, but because the cloud layer thins for a brief moment. The world outside does not transform, but it becomes momentarily more legible. You're asked to help gather stored water that has partially frozen overnight. The container near the edge of the room shows a thin layer of ice forming along its surface. You break it gently, mindful of not wasting what has already been collected. Scholars still debate whether water management practices in isolated mountain cabins were driven more by scarcity psychology or by structured conservation ethics developed through repeated seasonal hardship. Some suggest a cultural discipline of preservation emerged naturally, while others argue it was purely reactive. You realize how every action inside the cabin is connected to another. Breaking ice leads to water. Water supports cooking. Cooking supports warmth. Warmth supports survival. Nothing exists alone. The fire crackles more confidently now, and you feel the room settle into a familiar equilibrium again. It is not comfort in the modern sense, but something more basic, more elemental, like the removal of immediate uncertainty. A mainstream historical fact is that many mountain communities in the 1800s relied on centralized hearth systems not only for heat, but also for drying clothing, preserving food and maintaining indoor air circulation during long winters when external drying was impossible. You hang damp fabric near the fire and watch how slowly it begins to release moisture into the air. Steam rises in faint reds, disappearing almost immediately into warmth. The cabin breathes in its own way now. Expansion and contraction of heatwood, air and moisture form a cycle you're beginning to recognize without needing to consciously track it. Outside, the wind returns briefly, then fades again, as if uncertain whether it should fully reassert itself. You remain near the fire, not because you are instructed to, but because everything here quietly encourages it. The centre of warmth becomes the centre of attention and eventually the centre of thought. And in this steady repetition of small survival acts, the day continues forward without announcement, without ceremony, simply unfolding in its quiet, unbroken rhythm. The day does not announce itself here, it simply deepens. You notice how the cabin shifts from one phase of warmth to another, without any obvious signal, as if it has its own internal sense of pacing. The fire has settled into a dependable rhythm, no longer demanding constant attention, yet never truly becoming background either. You begin with water again, because water always comes first in this place, whether or not it feels important. The container near the hearth shows slow progress against the cold. Ice forms in delicate sheets along the edges, and you break it carefully, listening to the soft crack that feels almost too loud in the enclosed space. A mainstream historical fact is that in many 19th century mountain settlements, winter survival depended heavily on the continuous snow-melting systems often maintained throughout the day to ensure a steady supply of drinking water when natural sources were completely frozen or inaccessible. Outside to the world appears slightly brighter than before. Snow still covers everything, but the intensity of the storm has loosened further. The landscape is not yet revealed, but it is less erased than it was yesterday. You begin to sense depth returning beyond the window, even if distance remains unclear. A quirky tidbit from alpine cabin traditions describes how some families would place dark fabric near windows during snowfall to better observe snow accumulation rates, using contrast to judge intensity. While simple, this method reflects a practical adaptation to environments where measurement tools were limited. You sit again near the fire and the warmth feels more evenly distributed today. It no longer gathers in sharp pockets but spreads in a softer gradient through the room. You find yourself noticing which objects hold heat longer than others, almost as if they retain memory of the flame. Scholars still debate whether the psychological adaptation to prolonged winter isolation in mountain cabins was primarily driven by environmental conditioning, or whether human cognitive flexibility naturally reorganizes perception under repetitive survival constraints. Interpretations vary between learned behavior and innate adjustment. The cabin creaks in a familiar pattern as temperature differences shift between interior and exterior walls. You're no longer startled by these sounds. Instead, you map them mentally, recognizing which parts of the structure respond first to cold air pressure changes. You're asked to check stored food supplies again. The act is repetitive, but repetition here is not redundancy, it is assurance. Everything must be accounted for, even when nothing appears to have changed. A mainstream historical fact is that 19th century frontier mountain households often relied on preserved food systems such as dried meats, salted provisions, and root storage techniques designed to withstand months of winter isolation without external resupply. You notice how storage itself becomes a kind of ritualized care. Each item has a place not just for organization but for stability. When everything is in order, the mind relaxes slightly, even if only for a moment. A quirky tidbit from mountain oral accounts mentions that some families would rotate stored food items periodically, not for preservation purposes alone, but to maintain awareness of their remaining provisions, effectively creating a mental inventory through physical interaction. Outside, a faint movement in the snow suggests drifting patterns forming across the ground. The wind is not strong but persistent enough to reshape surfaces slowly over time. You watch this subtle transformation without urgency. Inside, the fire flares briefly as a new log catches. The sound is sharper for a moment, then softens again into steady burning. You notice how quickly your attention returns to it, as if it anchors perception automatically. Scholars still debate whether the central role of fire in isolated mountain living was purely functional, or whether it gradually acquired symbolic significance as the primary stabilizing reference point for time perception and emotional regulation. Some argue it replaced external temporal markers entirely. You adjust your seating slightly following warmth that shifts across the floor. The cabin is no longer experienced as a single unified space, but as a series of temperature zones that guide movement without instruction. The light outside changes again subtly as clouds thin and thicken in uneven succession. The world beyond the glass feels like it is breathing in slow intervals. A mainstream historical fact is that many mountain cabins in the 1800s were designed with minimal window exposure on wind-facing sides to reduce heat loss, concentrating openings where natural light could enter without significantly compromising insulation. You begin to understand why the cabin feels both enclosed and adaptive at the same time. It is not static architecture. It is a negotiation between permanence and environmental pressure. A quirky tidbit from isolated settlement records describes how some households would assign informal warm corners to each family member, creating preferred seating zones based on body heat patterns and social habit rather than fixed furniture arrangement. You remain near the hearth and the fire continues its steady conversation with the room. It is not loud, but it is constant enough to shape every this and that around it. And as the day stretches quietly forward, you realize that survival here is not defined by dramatic struggle, but by the accumulation of small repeated understandings that slowly become second nature. The cabin feels quieter today, though not in a way that suggests peace so much as adjustment. It is the kind of quiet that arrives after repetition has worn down uncertainty. You begin to notice that even silence has layers here shaped by distance insulation and the way snow absorbs sound outside. You start the morning again with fire, because everything still orbits around it. The embers are less fragile now than they were at the beginning of your stay, as if they too have learned your rhythm. You add kindling slowly, watching for the moment when heat becomes self-sustaining rather than assisted. A mainstream historical fact is that in many 19th century mountain cabins, fire tending was considered a shared responsibility among all household members regardless of age or role, because continuous heat was essential for both survival and indoor habitability during prolonged winter isolation. Outside the window, the world is still pale, but the brightness has changed character. It is less oppressive and more reflective, bouncing softly off snow surfaces that are beginning to settle into stable forms rather than shifting constantly. A quirky tidbit from alpine oral tradition describes how some isolated families would judge the progress of winter by the sound snow made underfoot during brief outdoor excursions, noting that older snow produced a quieter compression sound compared to freshly fallen layers. Inside, you notice how your attention now moves between tasks with less hesitation. Water, melting, fire maintenance, food, checks these actions no longer feel separate. They form a continuous loop of care. Scholars still debate whether the psychological adaptation seen in prolonged winter isolation reflects a restructuring of time perception, or whether it is primarily a survival-driven narrowing of cognitive focus toward immediate environmental demands. You sit near the fire and observe how it interacts with objects in the room. Wooden surfaces glow faintly where heat reaches them most directly. Metal tools retain warmth longer than expected, becoming secondary sources of heat in their own right. You are asked to step outside briefly to assess conditions. The transition from interior warmth to exterior cold is immediate and striking, but less shocking than before. Your body anticipates it now, bracing in a way that feels almost practiced. A mainstream historical fact is that mountain cabin dwellers in the 1800s often limited outdoor exposure during severe winter periods to short purpose-driven intervals, balancing necessary tasks such as wood retrieval or structural inspection against the risks of prolonged cold exposure. Outside, the snow surface is uneven, shaped by wind patterns that no longer feel aggressive but residual. You notice faint depressions that suggest previous movement, though time has erased any clear origin. A quirky tidbit from historical accounts of alpine settlements mentions that some individuals believed certain snow formations could indicate hidden ground contours beneath, using surface texture as a rough guide for safer walking paths, even if such interpretations were not always accurate. You return inside quickly, and the cabin accepts your re-entry without resistance. Warmth surrounds you again in gradual stages, not all at once. It takes time for cold to leave the body, and the fire seems to understand that process. Scholars still debate whether the embodied experience of temperature transition in isolated environments contributed to heightened environmental awareness, or whether it simply reinforced basic survival conditioning through repetition. You check stored supplies again, even though nothing appears altered. This repetition is no longer questioned. It has become part of the structure of the day itself. A mainstream historical fact is that preserved winter food systems in mountain cabins often included layered storage strategies where items were rotated according to spoilage risk and fuel availability, ensuring that consumption matched environmental constraints over extended periods. You notice how small changes in supply placement begin to matter more than they would in ordinary settings. A shifted container or partially used bundle feels significant because it alters future planning. A quirky tidbit from Mountain Survival Anecdotes describes how some households would keep a symbolic last item visible in storage areas to mentally reinforce awareness of scarcity, even when supplies were sufficient. The fire flares briefly again, responding to added fuel. The sound is familiar now, almost comforting in its predictability. You find yourself listening to it without intention. Outside, the wind rises slightly, then settles again, as if reconsidering its presence. Snow drifts gently across surfaces without urgency. Inside, the cabin remains steady, and you begin to understand that stability here is not absence of change, but the ability to absorb it without disruption. And in that quiet continuity of warmth, sound, and repetition, the day continues to unfold without marking its own passage. The morning arrives in a way that is not truly arrival at all, more a gradual increase in visibility through the cabin's small glass window. You notice how light behaves differently now compared to the earlier days of the storm. It no longer feels like it is pressing against the world. Instead, it spreads unevenly, as if testing how much it is allowed to return. You begin again with the hearth, because nothing meaningful starts without it here. The coals are still alive beneath a thin layer of ash, holding onto heat in a quiet, patient way. You feed them carefully, watching the moment when faint glow becomes active flame once more. A mainstream historical fact is that in 19th century mountain cabins, maintaining a continuously active firebed was considered more efficient than allowing full extinction and restarting since preserving. Embers reduced fuel consumption and conserved energy during long winters when wood gathering was limited. The interior of the cabin feels slightly more responsive today, as if the space itself has become familiar with your presence. You are no longer adjusting to it alone, it is also adjusting to you. Outside, snow appears less chaotic. The surface has begun to harden in places, forming subtle crusts that catch the faint light. The world is still dominated by white, but it is no longer entirely uniform. A quirky tidbit from Alpine settlement notes describes how some mountain families would observe the sparkle patterns onto snow surfaces to estimate temperature changes, believing that sharper glints indicated colder air conditions due to increased ice crystal formation. You move through your routine without hesitation now. Water is checked, melted, and replenished. Food stores are reviewed not as separate tasks, but as part of a continuous cycle of maintenance. Everything here is maintenance in one form or another. Scholars still debate whether the structured routines observed in isolated winter communities represent intentional systems of survival engineering, or whether they emerged organically through behavioral repetition shaped by the environmental necessity alone. You notice how sound has become more meaningful again. The crack of wood in the fire, the faint settling of snow on the roof, even the soft movement of your own clothing against heated air. Each sound carries information even when nothing obvious is changing. You are asked to step outside for a brief inspection of the surrounding area. The transition is still sharp, but your body no longer reacts with surprise. It anticipates the cold before it fully arrives. A mainstream historical fact is that many 19th century mountain cabins were positioned with careful attention to natural windbreaks using terrain features such as rock formations or tree lines to reduce exposure and improve long-term structural endurance during extended winter storms. Outside, the landscape feels less hostile and more dormant. Snow no longer falls as intensely. Instead, it rests layered and compacted as if the storm has paused rather than disappeared. A quirky tidbit from historical alpine records mentions that some isolated settlers believed that certain tree shapes emerging from snowdrifts could indicate underlying ground stability, using these visual cues to decide safer walking routes during winter travel. You return inside and the warmth welcomes you in stages rather than all at once. The fire seems stronger today, not because it has changed dramatically, but because your perception of it has stabilized. Scholars still debate whether long-term exposure to controlled heat environments in isolated cabins altered human temperature perception thresholds, or whether it simply heightened awareness of natural thermal gradients that are usually ignored in modern environments. You sit closer to the hearth without needing to decide to do so. Your body has already learned where comfort exists in this space. A mainstream historical fact is that indoor spatial organization in mountain cabins during the 19th century often evolved around heat distribution patterns, with frequently used areas naturally clustering around radiant warmth zones rather than fixed architectural planning. You begin to notice how objects in the cabin now feel permanently assigned to certain roles. Not just tools or furniture, but anchors of routine. A kettle near the fire, a stool angled towards the warmth, a storage crate positioned within its easy reach. A quirky tidbit from mountain oral tradition suggests that some families would assign informal heat ownership to certain objects, believing that repeated placement near the fire made them more reliable in cold conditions, even though this was more psychological association than physical effect. Outside, wind briefly returns, moving across the snow surface in soft waves rather than forceful gusts. It feels less like disruption and more like background motion. Inside, the fire continues its steady presence, and you realize how much of your awareness has become synchronized with it. Not dependent, but aligned. And as the day continues without sharp boundaries, you find yourself no longer waiting for change, only observing its slow, almost imperceptible unfolding. The cabin feels almost settled into itself now, as if it has accepted the rhythm you and the winter have created together. There is no dramatic shift when you wake, only a gradual awareness that warmth is already present, that the fire has been tended either by habit or by another hand moving through familiar motions before thought fully arrives. You move toward the hearth without hesitation. The coals are already glowing beneath a soft cover of ash that holds heat like a memory that refuses to fade. You feed it slowly again, watching how fire in this place is never sudden, but always negotiated. A mainstream historical fact is that in 19th century mountain cabins, fire continuity was often prioritized over comfort, with families carefully preserving ember beds overnight to ensure that morning ignition required minimal fuel and reduced exposure to cold during early hours when temperatures were at their lowest. Outside the window shows a quieter world than before. Snow is no longer falling heavily. Instead, it rests in layered stillness, broken only by subtle shifts where wind has sculpted soft ridges across the surface. A quirky tidbit from alpine oral accounts describes how some mountain dwellers believed the direction of smoke from chimney vents could reflect distant weather changes, interpreting slight shifts in drift patterns as indicators of incoming cold fronts, even though such readings were highly inconsistent. Inside, you notice how the cabin no longer feels divided into separate zones of warmth and cold in such sharp contrast. The gradients are still there, but they feel softer now, more familiar to your senses. Scholars still debate whether prolonged seasonal isolation in mountain environments leads to altered spatial awareness, where individuals begin to perceive heat and cold not as fixed states, but as continuous gradients shaping daily behavior and movement patterns. You check water again, though nothing demands urgent attention. The habit persists because predictability has become its own form of stability. You are asked to organize firewood, a task that once felt mechanical but now feels almost meditative. Each piece is inspected, sorted, and placed with quiet intention. A mainstream historical fact is that wood management in isolated 19th century mountain cabins was a critical survival skill, with families often categorizing fuel by burn rate and density to optimize heat output during prolonged winter confinement when resupply was impossible. Outside light changes slightly, not brighter exactly, but more defined. The snow surface reflects it in a way that makes distant shapes slightly easier to distinguish, though still softened by cold air and haze. A quirky tidbit from mountain survival traditions suggests that some households would stack firewood in alternating directions, believing it improved airflow and drying efficiency, a practice that sometimes aligned with practical ventilation principles, even if its origins were based on observation rather than formal science. You notice how the act of organizing wood creates a sense of order that extends beyond the task itself. The cabin feels more structured afterward, as if your arrangement of objects subtly reinforces the stability of the space. Scholars still debate whether repetitive manual tasks in isolated environments serve primarily as cognitive anchors that reduce anxiety, or whether they simply emerge as necessary responses to environmental demands that leave no room for abstraction. The fire responds as you adjust its fuel, briefly brightening before settling again into steady burn. You have begun to recognize its language without needing to interpret it consciously. Outside wind moves across the valley in a low, distant motion, not strong enough to disrupt, but enough to remind you that the world beyond the cabin is still active. Inside, everything remains oriented around warmth, not in a symbolic way, but in a practical one that has gradually become indistinguishable from habit. A mainstream historical fact is that many mountain cabins in the 1800s relied on centralized hearth design, not only for heating efficiency, but also for indoor air circulation, as controlled ventilation through chimney systems helped manage smoke and maintain breathable interior conditions during an extended winter occupation. You sit once more near the fire without thinking about why. It has become the default position of thought, rest, and awareness. A quirky tidbit from Alpine oral histories mentions that some families would time daily activities based on the sound of firewood cracking, using subtle auditory cues from combustion changes as informal markers of passing hours when external timekeeping was unavailable. Scholars still debate whether such sensory-based time perception represents a form of adaptive temporal cognition, or whether it is simply the brain compensating for the absence of structured clocks by assigning meaning to environmental repetition. And as the cabin holds steady in its quiet equilibrium of warmth and snowbound silence, you realize that the winter is no longer something pressing against you, but something you are now moving within. The sense of time has softened even further now, not disappearing, but loosening its grip. You no longer mark the day by any clear boundary, only by shifts in light fire behavior and the subtle needs of the cabin itself. Winter here does not move forward in steps, it drifts. You begin the familiar routine again with the hearth, though by now it feels less like a task and more like continuation. The fire is steady enough that it does not require persuasion-only attention. You add fuel, slowly observing how even small changes alter the room's entire atmosphere. A mainstream historical fact is that in 19th century mountain cabins, fire tending was often distributed across the entire day rather than concentrated into specific hours, because maintaining a stable internal temperature required constant adjustment to external weather fluctuations and fuel availability. Outside, the snowfield appears more settled than ever. The surface is smoother in some areas, rougher in others, perhaps shaped by invisible wind patterns that pass through during the night. There is no urgency in the landscape, only accumulation and quiet transformation. A quirky tidbit from Alpine settlement records describes how some isolated families would observe animal tracks in snow, not only for signs of wildlife presence, but also as informal indicators of snow depth, stability, and crust strength, even when interpretations were not always reliable. Inside, you notice how the cabin sounds have become part of your internal rhythm. The creak of timber, the soft collapse of ash in the hearth, the faint movement of air through small gaps in the walls. Each sound feels familiar enough now that silence would feel incomplete without them. Scholars still debate whether a prolonged exposure to isolated winter environments enhances auditory sensitivity as a compensatory adaptation, or whether individuals simply learn to assign greater meaning to subtle environmental noise due to reduced sensory input overall. You check water again, the pattern rarely changes. Ice forms, is broken, melted, and replenished. The cycle is simple, but its repetition gives it weight. You're asked to briefly step outside to assess snow accumulation near the cabin walls. The cold greets you immediately, not harshly anymore, but with undeniable presence. Your body reacts quickly, then settles into acceptance. A mainstream historical fact is that mountain cabins in the 1800s often required regular exterior inspection during winter months to prevent snow buildup against structural walls which could compromise insulation and increase moisture intrusion if left unmanaged for long periods. Outside, the world feels paused rather than empty. Snow rests heavily on branches, forming shapes that look almost intentional. The air is still enough that even distant movement feels noticeable. A quirky tidbit from mountain oral tradition suggests that some settlers believed trees bent under snow load were resting and would avoid disturbing certain groves during winter, out of respect for their perceived seasonal vulnerability. You return inside and feel the warmth gradually reclaim you. The transition is familiar now, almost staged, as if the cabin prepares you for it in advance. Scholars still debate whether the human ability to acclimate to extreme seasonal isolation reflects physiological adaptation over time, or whether it is primarily a psychological reframing of discomfort into manageable expectation. You sit again near the fire, watching how it continues without interruption. It no longer feels like an event. It feels like an environment within the environment. A mainstream historical fact is that many 19th century mountain households developed layered clothing and proximity-based heating strategies, allowing individuals to regulate body temperature not only through garments, but also through spatial positioning within heated zones of the cabin interior. You notice how your movement patterns have become economical. You no longer cross the room without reason. Every shift in position is guided by warmth, necessity, or habit that has become indistinguishable from instinct. A quirky tidbit from Alpine survival accounts mentions that some families developed informal seating hierarchies near the hearth where preferred warmth spots were rotated over time to distribute comfort evenly among members during long winter stays. Outside wind briefly rises, then fades again. The snow remains unchanged, but the air above it feels alive with subtle motion. Inside, the fire continues its steady conversation with the room, shaping everything it touches without ever fully dominating it. And as the quiet rhythm of survival deepens into something almost unspoken, you realize that nothing here is standing still, even when everything appears to be. The winter has reached that stage where it no longer feels like something arriving or departing. It simply exists around you, like a condition the world has agreed to maintain for a while. Inside the cabin, this shift is subtle but unmistakable. You notice it in how little urgency remains in any single action. You begin again with the hearth. Though by now the phrase begin again feels almost unnecessary. The fire is no longer fragile. It is established, maintained through countless small decisions that have become automatic. You add wood with measured calm, watching the flame respond like a living memory of every previous day. A mainstream historical fact is that in 19th century mountain cabins, sustained winter survival depended heavily on fuel forecasting, where households estimated wood consumption not by daily use alone, but by projecting entire seasonal requirements based on early winter conditions and accessibility to surrounding forests. Outside, the snow has settled into deep continuity. The landscape is no longer in motion, except in very slow terms. Wind still passes through occasionally, but it no longer reshapes everything it touches. It only adjusts what is already there. A quirky tidbit from Alpine oral accounts describes how some mountain dwellers believed they could predict seasonal length by observing how quickly snow formed layers on specific roof angles, even though this method varied widely depending on exposure and structure design. Inside the cabin feels almost like it has learned your habits as much as you have learned its structure. You know where warmth collects without needing to think. You know where cold persists without needing to check. Scholars still debate whether long-duration habitation in isolated environments leads to a merging of spatial awareness and behavioral routine, or whether individuals simply become more efficient at navigating constrained environments over time. You check water and the routine feels as almost ceremonial now. Ice forms is broken, melted and replaced. The simplicity of it carries weight not because it is difficult, but because it is constant. You are asked to step outside for another brief inspection, though now even these transitions feel less like interruptions and more like extensions of the same ongoing state. A mainstream historical fact is that many 19th century mountain cabins incorporated elevated thresholds and reinforced entryways to reduce snow intrusion during winter storms, an architectural adaptation that helped maintain interior stability despite external accumulation pressures. Outside, the air feels clearer than before, though not warmer. The cold is still present, but it no longer carries the same sense of confrontation. It feels neutral, almost expected. A quirky tidbit from mountain settlement tradition suggests that some isolated families would mark seasonal progress by how deeply doorways became framed by surrounding snow, using gradual accumulation as a visual calendar of winter duration. You return inside and the warmth settles into you in stages. It is no longer surprising, it is re-entry into a system you're fully part of now. Scholars still debate whether thermal adaptation in prolonged cold environments is primarily physiological acclimatization or whether it is largely a psychological recalibration of perceived discomfort thresholds over time. You sit near the fire again, though your presence there no longer feels intentional. It is simply where you are when nothing else demands otherwise. A mainstream historical fact is that centralized hearth systems in mountain cabins were often maintained not only for heat, but also for indoor air quality regulation, as controlled combustion and chimney draft helped reduce smoke accumulation in enclosed living spaces during extended winter occupation. You notice how the fire now feels less like an object and more like an atmosphere. It does not occupy space so much as define it. Everything else exists in relation to it. A quirky tidbit from alpine survival accounts mentions that some households developed informal fire listening, where individuals could distinguish changes in wood moisture or airflow conditions by subtle variations in crackling patterns, even if these interpretations were not formally standardized. Outside, the wind moves again briefly, then stops. Snow remains undisturbed, holding its layered silence. Inside, everything continues without announcement. No moment marks itself as significant, yet every moment contributes to a pattern that is becoming unmistakably familiar. And as the cabin holds steady in its warm, enclosed rhythm, you begin to understand that endurance here is not a single act, but the quiet accumulation of days that refuse to end loudly. The final stretch of winter does not announce itself with clarity. It arrives instead as a kind of softness in the air, a subtle loosening of pressure that you only notice when you realize you are no longer bracing against anything in particular. The cabin feels the same, yet somehow less enclosed by urgency. You move through the morning with a calm familiarity that would have been impossible at the beginning of your stay. The fire is still central, but no longer demanding constant negotiation. It holds steady, as if it has entered a long conversation with the season and found a stable tone within it. A mainstream historical fact is that in 19th century mountain regions, the final phase of winter was often the most carefully managed period, as households balanced remaining fuel reserves with the gradual return of accessibility to outside resources, ensuring survival until early spring. Thaw allowed limited resupply. Outside, the snow no longer feels like a solid presence pressing against the world. It is still deep, still dominant, but it now carries subtle signs of change. Light lingers a little longer on surfaces. Shadows feel less dense. The landscape is not yet transformed, but it is no longer static. A quirky tidbit from alpine settlement traditions describes how some mountain families believed the sound of dripping meltwater within walls marked the true beginning of a seasonal transition, interpreting it as the moment winter started to release its grip, even though this was more symbolic than measurable. Inside, you notice how your perception of the cabin has fully shifted. It is no longer experienced as a shelter against winter. It is experienced as a system you have been temporarily integrated into, one that shaped your routines as much as you shaped its daily functioning. Scholars still debate whether long-term seasonal isolation in mountain environments leads to permanent cognitive restructuring of environmental awareness, or whether these changes fade quickly once individuals return to more stable and resource-abundant settings. You check water out of the habit, but even that action feels less urgent now. Ice still forms, but more slowly. The cycle continues, yet its intensity has softened. You are asked to step outside one final time in this sequence of days, not because anything is wrong, but because observation has become part of survival itself. A mainstream historical fact is that many 19th century mountain cabins were built with anticipation of seasonal cycles rather than constant habitation, meaning their structural design prioritized endurance through harsh winter periods, followed by relative inactivity during warmer months when access and maintenance were easier. Outside, the air feels different again, not warm but less resistant. Snow still covers everything, yet it no longer feels like it is actively enforcing separation between objects. Instead, it rests. A quirky tidbit from mountain oral accounts mentions that some isolated settlers believed the first visible patches of bare ground in spring would always appear in places where animals had moved most frequently during winter, treating these early openings as signs of returning ecological order. You return inside and notice how easily the transition happens now. Cold no longer lingers in your body as sharply. The fire receives you without effort, as if you have always been part of its space. Scholars still debate whether human adaptation to extreme seasonal environments creates lasting perceptual changes in temperature sensitivity, or whether these shifts are entirely context-dependent and reversible once environmental conditions normalize. You sit for a long moment without adjusting anything. The cabin is quiet in its own layered way, not empty but complete in the sense that nothing demands correction. A mainstream historical fact is that mountain cabin survival in the 19th century depended as much on psychological endurance as physical resources, with many accounts emphasizing routine repetition and environmental attunement as essential components of long-term winter habitation. You realize now that what began as endurance has become familiarity. The cold outside is no longer an adversary. It is simply part of the system that made this quiet interior possible. A quirky tidbit from alpine survival tradition suggests that some families would mark the end of winter not by date or weather alone, but by the moment firewood consumption noticeably decreased, signaling reduced need for constant heating. Scholars still debate whether the subjective sense of winter's end is driven more by environmental change or by human perception adjusting to accumulated familiarity over time. The fire continues its steady presence, but it no longer defines everything. It simply exists like everything else. And as the winter finally begins to loosen its hold beyond the walls, you remain in the quiet space it shaped, carrying its rhythm with you even as it slowly fades into memory. Now dim the lights, let your thoughts settle the way snow once settled outside this cabin. There is nothing left to manage, nothing left to track. Only warmth lingering in memory and silence that no longer feels heavy. Sleep arrives not as escape, but as continuation of stillness. Sweet dream, nam rain.